How many people weren't here yesterday? Okay, weren't. Okay, yes you were. Okay, well, welcome to you and welcome to those who are our union president, so I can shush you. And welcome to those online who are joining us today. We had 9,000 web page clicks yesterday. That is massive. And so those of you who are returning today, welcome. Those of you who didn't make it yesterday and are online, there will be panel by panel versions that will be put up with a little commentary relating to them before too long. We won't get too prescriptive about exactly when. And those who weren't here yesterday, also we had an amazing mihi whakatau from Ngāti Whātua who reminded us very clearly of whose place this is, and when we're thinking about values and we're thinking about directions and we're thinking about power, that Te Tiriti o Waitangi has to be the foundation for that process. And I know that that will be a theme through today as well. Just to mention a couple of housekeeping things. Toilets down there. There is tea and coffee there. Please, koha is very welcome because there's very little funding for this. There is a Wi-Fi, guest Wi-Fi, which also has the details on there, and there are a few copies, hard copies of the program, which you can also access online. Today we're going to continue the process of discussion through panels, with panels on health and knowledge and rights and protections and development, and then reinvigorating the local. The last part, we are going to have the video we didn't have yesterday morning because processes are unpredictable with their timing. So Jim Stanford's video on the Centre from the Centre for Future Work in Australia about thinking on alternatives that he's been doing. We'll start the final session with that video, and then we'll have discussion about ideas of where to from here. And we are wanting you to think about what should happen next, and as a part of the stimulus for that, Laila Hare is going to do a bit of a recap from yesterday and has some fun things for you to do, and then we'll move into the first panel on health.
Morena. So, this session is really just for all of us, really, to consolidate our thinking following the various addresses and panels yesterday. And so I just thought I'd start with providing a little bit of a framework that came to my mind for slotting all that information, that passion, that reflection that we were privileged to be part of yesterday, and then to give you a chance to, which is why if you haven't got 3 little post-it notes, I'm a adult educator, you see, so you carry post-it notes around in your handbag. If you haven't got 3 of these, then I'll bring them to you in a moment. So it seems to me that yesterday is sort of really strong theme, which was defined from the very beginning in the whakatau, and particularly strongly expressed, I think, in the panel on Te Tiriti, that trade is a means of relationship. It's a way that we relate to each other within our communities. It's a tool we use to relate to the wider world, and that in any relationship, for us to be truly in an equal or respectful relationship, we need to first define ourselves. We need to know who we are. We need to be relating to others from a position of clarity about our kaupapa, our values, and our objectives. And so, and I think that sort of came through very clearly yesterday, that that a lot of the debate, the discourse, the evidence around trade is that and our approach to trade as a nation is that it does not operate with clarity or agreement about who we are as a nation and what we want to achieve within our communities. So I sort of broke things down really into three key themes for me from yesterday, which relate to our kaupapa in this gathering, which is to develop alternatives and progressive models for Aotearoa in relation to trade with the wider world. The first sort of theme was around the values and objectives that inform our trade policy. And the alternative values and objectives that would be needed to inform an alternative trade policy or approach to trade. And it seems to me that what came through very strongly in the discussions yesterday was the importance of values and objectives which enable flourishing within our own communities, which allow various forms of democratic participation in the defining of our economic and social objectives as individual communities, whether it's South Auckland or Ngāti Porou or Tūhoe or other types of communities. And so it seemed to me there was a very strong sort of sense that the objectives and values that underpin our existing approach to trade, our formal approach to trade, are somehow out of sync with the values and objectives we have as communities and people. So what I'm going to ask you to do in a moment when you reflect a little bit yourself is on one of these post-its that you've got, to put your own reflection based on what you heard yesterday or what you came into the hui with already in your mind or what you think about right now, to reflect on the values and objectives that you would want to, how you would characterise the most important values and objectives that should underpin an alternative and progressive trade system. So that's post-it 1, values and objectives. The second sort of theme that came through quite strongly, I think, in many of the discussions was alternative forms of trade and alternatives to trade in order to achieve these values and objectives. So we're, as Ani, I think, very clearly described the process from kaupapa to tikanga, that the values and objectives might be the kaupapa. There are different trade forms and alternatives to trade in order to achieve those values. So, for instance, Bernard Hickey talked about the sort of risks of these large digital corporates and talked about alternatives to even utilising that form of gaining access to the services that we want. So he said to ban them. You might have a different view on that. Tanya Pōwhare talked about the procurement issues, as did Annie Newman with the Living Wage campaign. These are alternatives to trade. So at the moment we trade to get the things we want. people were suggesting alternative ways of getting what we want without engaging in trade, by using the resources in our local communities, our national society and so on. But also alternative forms of trade, so Indigenous trade, for instance, and direct relationships between Indigenous people. So the second post-it note is going to be your reflection, idea, whatever, just one thing is great, which responds to this theme of alternative trade forms and alternatives to trade. Okay? And then the third sort of theme that emerged for me, and I think in many ways it's been the dominant kind of theme around the whole discussion, over many years in New Zealand around trade, is the agreements themselves and the treaties and rules that apply to the international trading system and to New Zealand's part and investment agreements in that system, the sort of regime of international economic law and the agreements that are a product of that regime. And we've often focused on that without focusing on the values, without focusing on the forms of trade or the alternatives to trade as a way of achieving our values or expressing our values and achieving our objectives. And so there were many sort of contributions to that discussion yesterday. There were clearly different kinds of agreements or differences in the kinds of agreements we have that express, for instance, Indigenous rights. There were questions around or issues around the use of investor-state dispute settlement, ISDS, as a kind of key aspect of investment agreements. There were issues relating to government procurement, which of course is a feature of many agreements and limitations on our government and local government's ability to procure because of the agreements that we've made. There were issues around labour, environment, gender. There will be issues, I'm sure, in the panel this morning around public health and how those are reflected in the current agreements we have. And I'd note with all of those areas, labour, environment, gender, public health, there are whole other international legal frameworks which become, I would argue, subservient to the economic agreements. And so, one of the alternatives that people have been raising in those discussions is to, instead of trying to integrate those into trade and investment agreements, to instead strengthen the international support systems for labour rights, for environmental survival, we could say now in the context of climate change, for gender equality, and I'm sure for public health as well. So that's the third post-it note, is on what reflection you have on the agreements themselves that would support these alternative trade forms or alternatives to trade, and that those themselves support the values and objectives that you have. So, it's over to you now. What I'd suggest you do is take a moment, if you're sitting next to someone you might want to have a quick discussion about this. There are 3 windows up there. One says alternative values and objectives. One is alternative trade forms or alternatives to trade. And the third is alternative agreements. Yep. Okay, yep. So you can mull over those 3 kind of dimensions of the discussion. And if you have a reflection, an idea, an emotion, an expression that you want to capture in writing, and you can categorise it into one of those three, and if it's in another category, that is fine too. Kia ora.
Kia ora, ngā mihi mahana kia koutou, and warm Pacific greetings to you.